Hi. Hi, so my name's Flo Atherden. I did my PhD at the University of Southampton, but I'm now a postdoc at British Antarctic Survey, and I'm going to be talking to you guys about the importance of fats in the polar environments. So we're going to be looking across a bunch of scales. So we're going to be looking at the molecular level, and hopefully by the end of this presentation, you can see how we can go from absolutely minute scales all the way to all of these processes influencing the globe. So this presentation is Arctic focused, but a lot of the same principles apply to the Antarctic. So we're focusing in on zooplankton and phytoplankton. So these are these two groups here. Phytoplankton are similar to plants. So they use photosynthesis and they create the food using the sunlight. And then zooplankton eat phytoplankton, and this dynamic between the two of them is so important for transferring energy to other animals. So animals like whales, fish, seabirds, they can't generally eat the phytoplankton because it's so small. So it's on the scale of a couple of cells, so it's absolutely minute. But the zooplankton can, and then the zooplankton themselves are larger, which means that this link between the phytoplankton and the zooplankton is the link between getting photosynthetically derived food to the rest of the food web. So the poles are highly productive. The Arctic has some of the most productive fisheries on Earth, and this is big business as well. So these are billions of pounds worth of fish are present in these oceans, and at the same time, Arctic tourism is increasing, and it's important to maintain the wildlife there in order to maintain that industry as well. So looking at it from an ecological perspective, these environments are highly important, but also from an economic perspective as well. On top of sustaining food webs and sustaining fisheries, a really important part of that zooplankton, phytoplankton dynamic is carbon storage. So the ocean has a huge capacity to store carbon just by dissolving atmospheric carbon into the water. But this process can then be kick-started and intensified by the animals that live there. So the phytoplankton converts the dissolved carbon in the water into molecules, and it's then eaten by the zooplankton. And as the die, and the zooplankton die, and the zooplankton defecate, this releases a lot of carbon material into the ocean, and it sinks. And it sinks into the deep ocean. And this pretty simple concept, this pretty simple process, sequesters a huge amount of carbon. So we call this the biological carbon cycle. And the biological carbon cycle stores between 5 and 12 billion tons per year. So just to put that in perspective, that's the same as the weight of 10,000 to 24,000 Burj Khalifas. And if we were to try and pay any money to store a similar amount of carbon, that would be between 75 and 600 billion to store. So it's a really important process that we rely on globally to keep our atmospheric CO2 levels lower. And these are zooplankton, so these are the guys that are super important in that whole story. And obviously they look very different, they're pretty diverse, and they're pretty small. So, you know, some of these are a couple of centimeters, most of these are only a few millimeters in size. But there are so many of them, so much so that if we weighed all of the humans on Earth, they would weigh less than all of the zooplankton in the ocean. And the poles are particularly important when we talk about the biological carbon pump, because they're this really productive, very efficient ecosystem. They're capable of storing up to 60% of the total ocean carbon storage. So they're really, really effective at storing this carbon. They're really good at getting the carbon into the deep ocean. And this is also partly why the polar oceans are so vulnerable to ocean acidification, because they absorb so much carbon, they become more acidic much faster than any other region. So the reason that the poles are so effective at storing carbon is partly because it's fresher water, so that lets it hold more CO2 dissolved in the water, but also because these regions are so productive. So it's the biology here that plays a huge part of their carbon storage ability. So if we think about life in the poles, the higher we get, the more of a strong seasonal signal that we get. So towards the North Pole, we get sunlight 24 hours during the summer, and then we get no sunlight during the winter. So if you're phytoplankton and you generate your food based off light, obviously you can only do this in summer, which means that we only get sort of new food generated in spring and summer. These phytoplankton, these little cells then die, and then that's it, the amount of food that's available for the rest of the animals throughout the year. So how do they survive? How do we get whales? How do we get seals? How do we get fish? This is where zooplankton come in. So in the poles, lots of zooplankton live for multiple years, and it's that aspect of elongating the amount of food that's available because the zooplankton live for multiple years. That means that the rest of the food web can be sustained. So how do these zooplankton manage it? How do they manage it when they're phytoplankton? Their food only lives for a couple of weeks. This is where fats come in. So fats make life at the poles possible. So animals at the poles, they need a lot of fat. It's absolutely essential for food storage. It's really important for buoyancy as well, and we'll talk about that later. But also for mammals, it's important for warmth and regulating their body temperature. But where do these fats come from? Well, they come from the phytoplankton. And because all of these animals here, like the fish and the seals, can't eat the phytoplankton, they come from the zooplankton. But not all fats are equal. So some fats are better than others. And I'm sure you've heard of omega-3 fatty acids. We're often told to eat them and consume them for our own health. So in terms of the human health benefits, it's been associated with improving inflammation. It's to do with reducing heart disease. It's meant to improve your autoimmune diseases as well and boost your mental health. There are a whole host of health benefits associated with omega-3 fatty acids, and that's why we're told often that we need to consume them. And we often are given supplements in fatty acids in the form of fish oil, but you can also get vegan fatty acids, and that's because these come directly from the phytoplankton. So animals can't make these omega-3 fatty acids themselves, they come directly from the phytoplankton. And in the Arctic and in the Antarctic, they come from diatoms and dinoflagellates. So these are the specific photosynthetic cells that come from them. And these guys are very, very productive in the Arctic and in at the poles. So you can see here from this graph, the green area is the chlorophyll. So you can see up in the Arctic here, you've got lots of green, which means that it's a really, really productive ocean. And that's where we get all of these omega-3s. So zooplankton are not only they're very fat, not only are they very energy rich, but they also accumulate a lot of these omega-3s. So I'm talking, and some zooplankton are better than others. So this species here is Calanus. Calanus is very fat and stores a lot of omega-3s. So it's energy rich and very nutritious. And you can see here, if I just circle this in red, that's their fat sac. So you can see that over 50% of their body volume is just pure fat, pure energy. Just a quick recap, we've been talking about fats, so these are that's the molecule side of things. We're talking about phytoplankton, that's the size of cells. The phytoplankton are then consumed by the zooplankton, which are then consumed by the fish and the whales. And we'll go through. So Calanus, the species that I was talking about before, that's very fat, has a very specific life cycle. So in spring and summer, it eats as much of those single-cell phytoplankton as possible. It accumulates a huge amount of fat and a huge amount of that healthy omega-3 fat. And then in autumn, when there's no more food, they migrate to depth. So they swim down to depths of greater than 500 meters. You can find them at depths of 2,000 meters. And when you think that these guys are, 3 millimeters in size, that's hugely impressive that they make that distance. And when they get to depth, they enter a hibernation. So they slow all their physiology down, and in doing that and living off their fats, they live at depth for 9 months. And in order to do this, they obviously have to accumulate a lot of fat. And they also have to have a very specific type of fat in order to sustain their buoyancy for that long. This process itself is also incredibly important for storing carbon. So before, when I talked about the carbon cycle, I talked about all that phytoplankton and the zooplankton dying and slowly sinking through the water column, whereas now the zooplankton are actively swimming to depth. And then they're living at depth and they're breathing and respiring carbon dioxide at depth. And that stores a lot of carbon in the deep ocean very, very efficiently. So if we think about, this has been measured in the North Atlantic and in the Arctic, and you can get between 1 and 6 grams of carbon stored per meter per year. If we compare that to the biological carbon pump, remember that 10,000 vertical ethers, then we can see that that's very similar and on a similar order. So it's actually an incredibly efficient process, and it stores a huge amount of carbon. So where we find calanus, so in the Arctic, we find that the larger, more fatty, more lipid-rich calanus appears higher up in the Arctic, and you get smaller, less fatty, less lipid-rich calanus lower down and more towards the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. And as we get closer up into the poles, we get more of that omega-3, that really healthy fatty acid. So calanus is really important for linking phytoplankton to the rest of the food web. It creates really high energy efficient food webs that are able to support more life. And it has a really high nutritional content as well, which is important for fisheries and fisheries management. And then when we think about their role in the carbon cycle, they contribute to the biological carbon pump by through that process of eating the phytoplankton. And then also they contribute through that process of migrating to depth and respiring all of their lipid at depth as well. So it's important to note that their behavior itself can influence the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. But climate change is rapidly impacting the poles. So the poles are warming 4 times faster than global average. Arctic sea surface temperatures have increased 1 degree per decade since the 1980s. Arctic sea ice has rapidly declined, and the ocean is acidifying faster than any other region. So what does this mean for our fats? So for the phytoplankton, animals that produce all of those fats, they're changing. We're seeing different types, different species, and also these phytoplankton are under stress. And that changes their ability to produce the amount of omega-3s that calanus and the rest of the food web rely on. How calanus uses its lipids is also changing. So as the temperatures increase and calanus experiences more stress, it may not be able to accumulate as much lipid as before. And so it being this really energy-rich and nutritious food source is changing slightly too. And also where we're finding calanus is changing. So as the Arctic is becoming warmer, it's becoming more Atlantic. And with that Atlantic-type water brings more Atlantic-type species. So we're seeing that smaller calanus that we would find in the Atlantic moving further up into the Arctic. So the Arctic is getting less lipid-rich. And so you get more of these smaller copepods moving through, and those individuals have less lipid themselves, and they also have a slightly different life cycle. And this can disrupt food webs. So in the North Sea, we've seen that Atlantic cod reproduction has been impacted because of some calanus species switching to a smaller calanus species, and this has led to a crash in cod stocks in the 1980s. And it's also been projected to effectively limit cod recovery as well, because they don't have as many of these really nutritious fats to rely on. A similar thing is happening in the Arctic with polar cod. So polar cod feed on young, large calanus, and as those calanus are being replaced by smaller species, this can impact the polar cod recruitment and reproduction themselves as well. But this is even more acute in the poles as well, because these polar cods themselves are also experiencing other stressors like decreasing sea ice, and there's more pressure on these polar cod to store fat over winter as well. So it's even more acute in the Arctic environment. We also see that in the North Pacific, there's been a regime shift from lipid-rich open ocean species towards more lipid-poor species that live towards the bottom of the seafloor. And so this is affecting fish that are important for fisheries. And it appears to be a reflection of the amount of those omega-3s that are available to the fish through the zooplankton and through the phytoplankton. This has implications for global human health. So currently there is a global shortage of the amount of omega-3 fatty acids that are available. So daily recommended intake is somewhere between 250 and 1,000 milligrams. And so the global requirement is around 1.4 million tons per year. But currently the marine environment is only able to supply just over half of that. So, and as we said before, we think about how many of the benefits that are associated with omega-3 fatty acids. So this has potential to become a distinct human health issue as well. And then we need to think about their role in the carbon cycle. So If you think about the carbon pump, remember that was 5 to 12 billion tons of carbon in the ocean per year, so that's 10,000 to 24,000 Burj Khalifas, and that the poles themselves are responsible for a huge chunk of that biological carbon. And so if we're impacting the animals and their ability to go through the biological carbon pump, we're impacting how effective oceans are at storing carbon. And crucially, we impact the lipid pump. So this is that aspect of the calamus accumulating lots of fat and then migrating to depth and respiring and living off that lipid at depth. And if we change the amount of lipid they have, we change how long they can live at depth. We change how much of that carbon can be stored at depth. And we can also change, because of the effect on their buoyancy, where in the water column they migrate to. And that can impact how long that carbon is actually stored for. So whether it's stored for decades, hundreds of years, or thousands of years. So hopefully in this presentation you've seen how we've gone from a molecular level all the way over to global implications. And it's really important here to realize that through each step, there's lots of different interactions, but that in this aspect of it, calamus is really important for linking all of those processes together. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? It's a good question. So the sort of role of calamus in polynyas is less known because of how difficult they are to study. So, and that's more right up in the high Arctic. So the majority of calamus work, it takes place in the Atlantic and in the Fram Strait, where it's more of an open ocean environment. So under ice is less well known just because it's really hard to study. But there you would find more ice-associated species like that are really large. And so it's thought that those environments could be very, very efficient at sustaining calamus and also sustaining the biological carbon pump. But it's less well studied in terms of the exact calamus-specific dynamics than open ocean environments. Hi. Hi. Yeah, copepods do have an influence on the ion pump. I think it's partly that through this process of the lipid pump, it's decoupled from other nutrient cycles. So by just respiring carbon at depth and excreting different elements at the surface, it can make sure that just carbon itself is stored at depth rather than other important nutrients that can be associated with dead carcasses and dead fecal pellets, for example. But I think the specific role of iron in that is currently being studied and looked into in more detail in the Antarctic. If anyone's interested in knowing any more about polar zooplankton and how they influence global processes, there are a few projects here if people are interested. Okay. Thank you.